3. September 1943. Camp Huntsville, Texas. The sun was already high when Obergefreiter Karl Weber stepped off the canvas-topped truck and onto American soil for the first time, his boots touching the crushed white stone of the processing yard. The air felt wrong to him. It was heavy, rich with heat and the smell of pine, without the sour smoke and petrol that had hung over every port and rail yard he had passed since 1939. He had left Germany as a radio operator with the 15th Panzer Division in North Africa, captured outside Tunis in May, along with tens of thousands of others when the last positions collapsed. Now he stood in front of neat wooden barracks surrounded by a double fence, a row of guard towers, and a line of American soldiers who watched in silence, rifles slung but not aimed. Karl's hands moved unconsciously over his tunic as he felt for the outline of the one object that mattered to him, the small brass tuning capacitor he had hidden behind a loose seam. It was useless on its own, a fragile piece of hardware from a ruined field set he had dismantled before capture. But for him it was also a promise. He had spent his entire adult life listening to signals cross the air, measuring the strength of distant transmitters, logging Allied call signs, tracking convoys by fragments of Morse. He knew that the air above this strange place, with its electric lights and endless trains, was thick with messages. As the Americans ordered them into lines and began the slow work of registration, his thoughts moved with mechanical calm. New world, new camp, new guards. Find the wires. Find the gaps. Find a way to hear. Karl's first hours in Camp Huntsville unfolded within a machine that dwarfed anything he had seen in the Wehrmacht. American clerks took his name, number, unit, and fingerprints, wrote them in ink, typed them again on cards, then copied them onto forms that vanished into filing cabinets. A military photographer sat him in front of a neutral backdrop that looked more like a studio than a prison office, snapped his image, and sent him on. He passed through a medical inspection that included vaccination, weighing, dental checks, and questions about his health that surprised him by their thoroughness. This routine was not ornamental. By September 1943, the United States held over 160,000 German prisoners of war, with the number climbing each month as new shipments arrived from North Africa and later from Europe. The War Department and the Office of the Provost. Marshal General had built a system of more than 100 main camps and hundreds of branch camps spread across over 40 states, all designed to process, house, feed, and work enemy prisoners while complying, at least outwardly, with the Geneva Convention. Each man was a file, a number, a labor resource, and a potential security risk. Statistical reports moved from camps like Huntsville to Washington every week, tracking headcounts, rations consumed, days of labor performed, incidents recorded. In this vast administrative structure, there were inevitably gaps, small spaces where a careful man might move unseen. Karl listened to the cadence of shouted English commands, watched the guards' relaxed posture, and noted that the Americans who marched them to Barracks 12 joked with one another about baseball scores and girls in town. They did not look like the starving enemies described in German newsreels. One of them pointed at a water tower and said something about the radio in the rec hall being too loud last night. The word caught in Karl's mind and lodged there. That first night in Barracks 12, Karl lay awake on his bunk beneath a low wooden ceiling threaded with electric wiring, the bare bulbs protected by metal cages. The barracks smelled of pine boards, canvas, dust, and the faint sweat of men exhausted by travel. Around him, fellow prisoners from North Africa muttered in the dark, some still complaining about the humiliation of capture, others marveling at the abundance they had seen since boarding the Liberty ships. Their stories were already forming a pattern. Food served in regular portions, white bread and meat instead of black crusts and thin soup. American port facilities with more cranes in one harbor than Germany could spare for an entire coastline. Rail yards lit up at night as if there were no war, no blackout, no fear of bombers. Karl listened and said little. His hands rested flat on his blanket, fingers tracing invisible circuits, mapping components he did not yet have. He thought of the receivers he had built from scraps in desert positions, the nights when he tuned into the BBC to hear enemy news, because it was often more reliable about German troop movements than their own filtered reports. He remembered the tight faces of officers who pretended not to hear the familiar tones of London coming through the headphones. Information was power, and the regime had hoarded it. Here, the Americans seemed flooded with it. In a camp like this, with electric power, repair workshops, scrap from trucks and kitchens and training schools, could he build something small, hidden, alive with the voices of distant transmitters? The rules on the bulletin board by the barrack door were clear enough. No radios, no weapons, no tunneling, no escape. Violations punished. But rules were one thing. Reality, he thought, was another. A radio need not look like a radio. It could be a box, a shelf, part of a bunk, a harmless object in a world of wood and wire. In the weeks that followed, Karl learned the clockwork of Camp Huntsville. Reveille at dawn. Roll call in the yard. Rows counted and checked. Breakfast in a mess hall with steam rising from vats of coffee and oatmeal. The clatter of metal trays and utensils. Work details formed and marched out under guard to cut timber, clear brush, harvest crops, or perform camp maintenance. The Americans used the prisoners to fill gaps left by young men sent overseas. For most of the Germans, this routine gradually softened the first shock of captivity. Letters from home began to arrive, censored but precious. Red Cross parcels promised, sometimes delayed. Rumors circulated about other camps: Camp McCoy in Wisconsin, Camp Hearn in Texas, Fort Robinson in Nebraska, each with thousands, all part of a prison system that by 1945 would hold over 370,000 German POWs on American soil. The numbers moved through the camp grapevine with the same weight as casualty reports had once done at the front. To Karl, the statistics meant something else as well. Every camp held radio men, electricians, engineers, men who understood circuits and code. Every week, some prisoners were transferred, moved by train in guarded cars from one camp to another, or to outlying labor detachments. In those movements, across thousands of miles of American rail lines, there were threads that could be pulled together. A set of call signs devised in secret, a handful of coded phrases hidden in letters, simple receivers built behind false walls that could all tune to the same shortwave band at agreed times. An invisible network that did not need a transmitter inside the camp if it could ride on American broadcasts, on the BBC, on Swiss stations, on neutral signals that crossed oceans. The idea that began as a technical challenge in Karl's mind slowly grew into a purpose. If he could hear, he could share. If he could share, he could connect men who thought they were isolated. The Americans believed each camp was its own sealed world. Karl Weber, radio operator, prisoner number repeating in his mind like a frequency, began to think of a way to prove them wrong. By October 1943, Karl knew every sound that belonged to Camp Huntsville and everyone that did not. The bugle at dawn, the scrape of boots on gravel at roll call, the slamming of mess hall doors, the clink of plates, the distant hum of generators behind the administration block, the short bursts of music and American voices that drifted from the recreation hall radio when the guards forgot to close the windows. That radio, placed for the benefit of the prisoners but only under supervision, was never close enough for him to study. It confirmed something important all the same. The camp was not sealed against the air. American news, swing music, war reports, and farm forecasts from stations in Houston and Dallas flowed in freely. In the barracks, men argued at night about whether to trust anything they heard. Some still clung to Nazi bulletins memorized from months before. Others compared Red Cross reports with American broadcasts and began to see patterns. Karl listened, sorted, and remembered. He volunteered for any work detail that went near the maintenance sheds, the burned-out truck behind the motor pool fence, the trash pit where broken objects went to die. There he saw what no German camp would have allowed to lie unused: coils of insulated wire, cracked headphones, shattered telephones with their carbon microphones and earpieces intact, empty syrup tins, razor blades, dry cell batteries, pieces of copper and brass. He knew from experience in the desert that a radio receiver needed no large transmitter tower, no glowing bank of tubes to frighten the guards. A simple crystal set, tuned correctly, could pull voices out of the air in silence. The Americans had forbidden radios, but they had also created the perfect environment for one: electric light, careless waste, and thousands of trained mechanics and signal men among their prisoners. The first time he whispered his idea to another man, a former Siemens electrician named Franz, the response was a slow nod and a single sentence. "It would be impossible," Franz said, and then added, "which is why it would work." Beyond the wire, the American war machine was settling into a pattern of mass that shaped everything inside the camp as well. In late 1943, Liberty and Victory ships crossed the Atlantic by the hundreds, carrying tanks, trucks, aircraft, ammunition, and food to Britain and North Africa, while returning with loads of prisoners instead of sailing empty. In Washington, staff officers calculated that every German prisoner working in American fields, sawmills, and factories released a civilian or soldier for more critical labor. By the end of the year, there were more than 200,000 Axis prisoners scattered from California to New Jersey, many in camps attached to large army posts or near industrial plants. Regulations based on the Geneva Convention required humane treatment, adequate food, and opportunities for work and recreation. Those rules were enforced with a mix of conscience and calculation. Well-fed prisoners were less trouble. Prisoners allowed to form camp newspapers and attend lectures were easier to monitor than prisoners left idle in bare compounds. The same policies that made the American POW system a comparative success also made it porous. The authorities counted heads and censored letters, but they did not fully understand the culture and skills of the men in their custody. Among them were hundreds of professional radio operators, engineers, and technicians trained to think in systems. In North Africa and Europe alike, German signals units had built and maintained networks under bombardment and in retreat. Men like Karl had spent years turning shortage into invention. In Huntsville, They now watched a rich country throw away components they once would have hidden under their greatcoats. The wider Allied intelligence services worried about organized resistance inside POW camps, and in some cases, American officers rotated hardline Nazi leaders to break up cells. But they looked mostly for open violence or escape plots, not for one quiet man tracing circuits in his head while he swept sawdust from a workshop floor. The first pieces of Karl's impossible radio came together not as a device, but as a map of the human terrain. In Barracks 12, there was Franz, from Siemens, who knew the feel of good germanium and the behavior of copper under strain. In Barracks 9, there was a former shipyard electrician from Kiel who understood grounding and lightning protection. At the far end of the compound, in Barracks 3, a young man named Otto had worked in a telephone exchange in Cologne and could fix a broken handset in minutes. The camp carpenter's shop employed prisoners to repair bunks and tables, and the scrap box there filled with bent nails, brass screws, and offcuts of hardwood that could be hollowed out. The Americans moved these men around freely, assigning work details based on skill. That freedom of movement inside the wire became Karl's first advantage. He spoke in low voices during lunch breaks, shared harmless memories where guards could hear, and then, when no one was close, added a single practical question. Could you remove a voice coil from a broken earpiece without breaking the housing? Could you file a razor blade without attracting attention? Could you bring a small length of insulated wire back in your pocket without boasting about it to friends? No one man saw the whole picture. To most of them, it was simply another small act of mischief, an old habit of soldiers who hated waste. At night, as the barracks quieted, Karl lay on his bunk with his hands behind his head and assembled these fragments in his mind. A coil wound from fine wire around a cardboard tube taken from a roll of American toilet paper. A detector made from 2 razor blades, one blued with a match flame, touched by a thin wire on a bent safety pin. An antenna hidden as a support wire for clothing lines in the attic. A ground connection made to the metal frame of a bunk that rested on the damp earth below the floorboards. Nothing that could not be explained away alone. Together, a receiver. To hide it, he chose an object no guard would waste time on. A thick wooden shelf bracket under the lowest bunk, drilled from behind and packed with wire and metal, its face left plain. It would require patience to build in daylight among 100 eyes, but that too was familiar work. The documentary record of German POWs in the United States shows how fragile and how remarkable such a scheme would have been. Most attempts at clandestine radios in camps like Camp Hearn, Camp McCain, or Papago Park ended in discovery when careless talk reached informers or when guards noticed antenna wires snaking where they did not belong. Yet a few cases stand out in post-war interviews and camp reports, where small crystal sets were hidden in table legs, hollowed broom handles, or false bottoms of lockers, used briefly to catch BBC News before being dismantled. Karl's design drew on these same principles, but he added one element shaped by his pre-war training and the scale of the American system. He did not want a radio only for his own barracks, or even just for Huntsville. The numbers that processed through the camp gates gave him a different vision. Thousands of prisoners arrived from North Africa. Then months later, hundreds were transferred north to Wisconsin, east to New Jersey, west to California, some for permanent relocation, others for seasonal work detachments. They carried stories, habits, and sometimes codes. If one small, silent receiver in Huntsville could reliably bring in shortwave broadcasts from London, New York, or neutral stations in Switzerland, Then its listener could select a narrow band of information and reduce it to simple phrases. Those phrases, disguised in letters or memorized by men marked for transfer, could travel to other camps. There, men who had been part of the original circle and built their own devices could tune to the same frequencies at agreed times. No transmission from inside the wire. No German voice crossing American air. Only listening posts linked by human carriers, a network laid across a continent on troop trains and mail sacks. In late November 1943, on a wet Sunday when the guards were slower and the barracks quieter, Karl crouched by the lower bunk with a small piece of sandpaper and a stolen razor blade, shaping the heart of the detector, while another prisoner at the door asked loudly in broken English about the next soccer match. The sounds of a country at total war hummed around them. A generator's steady beat, a distant train whistle, an American announcer's voice leaking from the rec hall, reading casualty lists and production goals. Within that landscape of power and numbers, a single prisoner of war, hands steady from long practice at a field set, began to coax an invisible line out of the air, reaching for voices he was not supposed to hear and connections no one believed possible. The first whisper from the outside world came late on a cold evening in early December 1943, when the barracks had settled into the soft murmur of card games, low conversations, and the occasional cough from a man already half asleep. Karl lay on the lower bunk in Barracks 12, his shoulders pressed against the wall, his hands apparently busy with a strip of cloth he pretended to sew. In front of him, fixed beneath the bunk slat and shielded from casual view by a folded blanket, the hidden components finally formed a crude but functional crystal receiver. A coil of fine copper wire, wound tightly around a cardboard tube, sat pressed against the rough wood. The detector, nothing more than 2 razor blades and a bent pin, adjusted with painstaking care, waited for the faint tension point where lead and steel met just so. The antenna was a length of wire that climbed inconspicuously along a corner post and vanished into the shadowed rafters, twisted to resemble a support for an improvised clothesline. A single earpiece made from a scavenged telephone capsule completed the circuit. There was no switch. The set lived or died by how gently he placed the improvised cat's whiskers on the blackened spot of the blade. His heart beat faster than Sean he liked as he fitted the capsule to his ear. Around him, men joked about the evening's stew. A guard's boots sounded briefly on the wooden steps outside, then faded. Karl rolled the fine pin with his fingertip until, beneath the wash of static and distant carrier waves, a human voice appeared, as fragile as breath. English words at first, then, as he tuned with a slow twist of the coil, German. Clear, measured, unmistakable. The British Broadcasting Corporation's European service, announcing the latest situation on the Eastern Front, naming cities he knew, divisions he recognized, losses far beyond anything German newspapers had admitted when he was still free. For a moment, he forgot to breathe. Then discipline returned. He pulled the capsule away, broke contact, and let the sound vanish. The entire contact had lasted less than a minute. It was enough. The impossible radio was no longer an idea. It worked. In the larger picture, that faint signal represented more than one man's act of defiance. By December 1943, shortwave broadcasts had become one of the central tools of psychological warfare and information control across the globe. The BBC, German State Radio, Radio Moscow, Voice of America, and neutral stations in Switzerland and Sweden all aimed their transmitters over borders and oceans, carrying news, propaganda, and coded messages. Millions of listeners across occupied Europe turned forbidden dials in darkened rooms to compare versions of the truth. In Germany, listening to foreign stations had been criminalized for years, punished as Wehrkraftzersetzung, undermining military strength. Men like Karl had enforced that rule at the front, even while secretly checking enemy frequencies for technical reasons. Now the situation had reversed. Inside American camps, the official flow of information followed strict channels. The U.S. authorities posted bulletins summarizing major events, allowed censored German newspapers to arrive weeks late, and sometimes played American radio news in recreation halls under guard supervision. Camp newspapers, edited by selected prisoners, mirrored these sources. They provided distraction and a sense of order, but not control. The Americans understood that accurate, verifiable information could also serve their purposes, undermining Nazi certainty by simple exposure to fact. Yet even this controlled flow remained, from the prisoner's point of view, fragmentary and subject to suspicion. A clandestine receiver changed the relationship. If prisoners could hear raw, unfiltered foreign broadcasts in real time, compare them with official notices, and trace patterns, they could form their own picture of the war. That picture might confirm defeat, expose lies, or harden resistance, depending on who listened. To American authorities, had they known of it, such a device would have been a breach of security. To Karl, who had spent years triangulating Allied traffic in service of the Reich, it was a way to reclaim his professional identity and, more quietly, to reconnect scattered men to a shared reality beyond the camp fence. In practice, the radio's first uses were cautious and narrow. For several nights, Karl operated alone, choosing hours when the barracks was quieter and guard routines predictable. He tuned to the BBC's German language service, to the monotonous yet reliable cadence of Swiss commentary, to American war news summaries that listed ship numbers, sortie counts, and production figures in tones of dry pride. He did not indulge in long listening sessions. Every extra minute increased the risk that someone would notice his posture, the faint concentration on his face, or the thin wire out of place. Instead, he listened in short bursts and treated the set like a reconnaissance instrument. He noted in his memory the date and time of reports about the fighting in the Donbass, about Allied tonnage landed in North Africa and Italy, about U-boat losses in the Atlantic that far exceeded what German command had admitted, about bombing raids on Hamburg and Berlin that matched whispers in letters from home. Then, in the mornings and during work details, he compared those internal summaries with what appeared on the official camp notice board or in the German language bulletins allowed through the censors. The discrepancies were stark. From London came specific lists of sunken U-boats and destroyed aircraft plants that German sources ignored or minimized. From American stations came open talk of output goals that, as a trained signalman, he recognized as both plausible and terrifying. Millions of tons of steel rolled from Midwestern mills, tens of thousands of aircraft built, thousands of ships launched. He began to see in numerical form what he had glimpsed in the Norfolk docks and train yards that had first brought him to this country. Those numbers, carried on invisible waves, were not just statistics. They measured the shrinking future of the regime that had sent him to war. He did not share these conclusions openly. He understood that among the prisoners were fervent loyalists who still believed in final victory, and informers who would trade any secret for favor. But he chose a handful of men whose skepticism he had already tested in careful conversation. sitting on a bunk during an ordinary evening, with a game of cards between them to mask their talk. He repeated a few figures in a neutral tone. Number of U-boats lost. Number of Allied aircraft produced in a single month. The scale of American shipbuilding. His friends stared, frowned, and finally conceded that the pattern matched what little they could verify. It was then that he first suggested, very quietly, that information could travel with them when they were moved to other camps. The crossings between personal experience and the wider machinery of war became, from that winter onward, the defining rhythm of Karl Weber's life as a prisoner in America. Transfer orders were a constant fact of the system. The War Department shifted work details with the harvest, moved construction gangs with new projects, and reassigned troublesome or influential prisoners to break up factions. Each train that arrived or departed from Camp Huntsville carried not only bodies, but knowledge. By early 1944, more than 1,000 German prisoners had already passed through Huntsville on their way to branch camps across Texas, to sawmills in Louisiana, to beet fields in Colorado, to new main camps in Oklahoma, Wisconsin, Kansas, and beyond. Among them were men who had, over shared meals and cautious whispers, heard pieces of what Karl's hidden receiver had extracted from the air. He began to select these travelers deliberately. When he learned that Franz from Siemens would be among a draft of men sent to a labor detachment near a new camp in Oklahoma, he spent several evenings with him, using a deck of cards and a noisy argument about football to cover a lesson in simple crystal set construction. He reduced the design to concepts that could survive a search. Count your turns carefully when you wind the coil. Use the thinnest wire you can find. Look for blued steel and carbon for the detector. Hide the set where no one thinks to look up or down, only straight ahead. Above all, he said, use it sparingly. For the Americans, he explained, the broadcasts are normal. For us, they can become a shared clock. On a certain night of the week, at a certain hour by Central Wartime, tune to this band, listen for this station, and note any mention of German prisoners, any changes in policy, any figures that matter. Later, others would refine this into a simple system of codes passed in letters that, to censors, read like ordinary complaints about weather or food. At the time, it remained little more than an understanding between a handful of men who had once served in the disciplined structures of the Wehrmacht's Signal Corps. Yet as those men boarded trains and rolled out of Huntsville, past the same American landscapes that had humbled them on arrival, they carried with them more than blankets and kit bags. They carried a method. In camp reports written by American officers months later, historians can see traces of what this seed became. Scattered references to suspicious wiring, to possible illicit listening devices, to rumors transferred between camps with surprising accuracy about battles that had only just taken place. These fragments suggest that, while no grand conspiracy ever existed in the manner of a spy novel, a loose web of listening and sharing did grow, made possible by a small, impossible radio built under a bunk in Texas, and by one prisoner's decision to trust his old craft more than his former masters. In January and February 1944, as cold rain turned the red Texas soil to slick mud between the barracks rows, the radio under Karl Weber's bunk settled from experiment into habit. It no longer felt like a miracle each time the detector found the narrow point where sound emerged from static, but he never allowed it to become casual. He listened in short, disciplined intervals, often while another man sat on the bunk edge above him, shuffling cards or repairing a shirt in plain sight of anyone who glanced over. The small circle of prisoners who knew something existed did not know everything. To one, he explained only how to strip thin insulation from a length of wire without leaving obvious teeth marks. To another, he demonstrated how a clothesline could be tied so the true antenna strand ran unnoticed among ordinary cord. To a third, he quietly repeated figures he had heard for Allied aircraft production. Thousands of bombers and fighters each month, drawn from a continent-wide network of factories the German General Staff had underestimated. When letters arrived from home describing ruins in Hamburg and Hanover, or shortages in the Ruhr, he mentally linked them to bombing raids he had heard described in detail on foreign broadcasts. The pattern hardened into something he could no longer dismiss as exaggeration. At night, lying on his bunk with the faint pressure of the earpiece against his temple, he felt the old professional certainty return. The signals did not care who he was now. They still carried facts across oceans and borders. He was once again the man who heard before others did, who could turn disjointed news into a coherent line. Only now, instead of feeding reports upward into a chain of command, he let them move sideways, man to man, carried in memory and disguised in casual words, among those he judged able to handle the weight without losing their reason or their caution. Outside the wire, the scale of the American prisoner system and the war it serviced grew with each passing month. By the spring of 1944, more than 250,000 German and other Axis prisoners were held across the United States in over 100 principal camps and hundreds of satellite detachments, guarded by units whose manuals emphasized order, efficiency, and adherence to the Geneva Convention. Prisoners harvested cotton in Texas, cut timber in the South, canned tomatoes in New Jersey, loaded freight in the Midwest, and built roads near army posts, supplying an estimated tens of millions of man-days of labor to replace Americans in uniform. Reports flowed from camp commandants to Washington summarizing work output, disciplinary incidents, educational programs, and morale. Inspectors who visited Huntsville and similar camps noted relative calm, adequate rations, and a mix of political views among the captives. They also recorded occasional discoveries of improvised devices, a crude radio hidden in a table leg at one camp, bits of wire and headphones in another, circuits scribbled on scraps of paper. Each find produced stricter searches, the removal of political leaders, and lectures on camp rules. Yet the overall assessment remained that most prisoners, especially those from units shattered in North Africa, had settled into a resigned acceptance of captivity. They obeyed roll calls, worked when ordered, played soccer in the yards, organized choirs and theater groups, edited camp newspapers with cautious articles about literature and agriculture. The American authorities saw little sign of organized resistance. What they could not fully trace were the quieter lines of contact that moved not through weapons or tunnels but through conversations, shaped by men with technical minds and long memories, carried by transfers and letters between facilities that shared no physical link except the same flag flying over the main gate. For Karl, the turning point between a local curiosity and a wider network came with the steady churn of transfers that marked early 1944. When a list went up assigning 50 men from Huntsville to a newly established branch camp near an ordnance depot in Oklahoma, he recognized 3 names of former signal troops with whom he had spoken at length. One of them, a thin, sharp-eyed corporal called Meissner, had shown an instinctive feel for tuning when he once tried Karl's earphone for a few seconds, under the pretense of adjusting a blanket. Now, on the last evening before departure, they sat side by side at a table while other prisoners signed their names on scraps of cardboard to trade for tobacco. Karl sketched nothing and wrote nothing, but he talked in a low, steady voice about routine camp problems and, folded into those comments, a set of instructions. If you find yourself in a place with electric light and careless scrap, use fine wire, not thick. Do not build anything large. The detector must be no bigger than your thumb. Hide it where the wood is thick. Choose an antenna that looks like laundry line, not like a wire. Above all, choose only 1 or 2 men to tell, and never boast. Then he added the detail that turned a clandestine receiver into a thread in something larger. On Sundays, he said, when lights out came later, tune your set around the 31-meter band at the 2nd hour after retreat, Central Wartime. Listen for the German service from London and for any mention of prisoners in America, new regulations, or major battles. You will not hear me, but you will hear what I hear. We can be sure we are listening together. If you must refer to this in a letter, speak of the late song on Sunday or the clear announcer from the island, nothing more. Meisner met his eyes briefly and nodded once, understanding more than the words said. When the transfer column marched out the next morning between rows of pine, boots crunching on gravel, Karl watched from the yard and felt for the first time since his capture that something of his choice was moving outward along with them. The great events of 1944 soon pressed down upon this fragile arrangement, turning shared listening into a link between men separated by hundreds of miles of American landscape. In early June, Karl's own hidden radio brought him the first detailed reports of the Allied landings in Normandy. Late evening in Texas, he adjusted the detector, found the familiar clear tone of the BBC, and heard calm voices announcing that on 6 June, Allied forces had landed on the coast of France with thousands of ships and aircraft, establishing beachheads at places whose names were read out with steady precision. The camp bulletins confirmed the invasion the next day, but their summaries could not match the volume of detail carried on the air. The creation of artificial harbors, the tonnage landed, the German divisions engaged. Listening in the dim barracks, Karl understood with a signalman's cold clarity that the war he had once served in the desert had passed a point of no return. A regime that had promised victory through will and blood now faced an enemy that could put an armada across the channel and keep it supplied indefinitely. Days later, in an Oklahoma branch camp where the wind moved dust across rows of ammunition sheds, a small group of German prisoners gathered in their own barracks around a segment of bunk frame that, if lifted, revealed a tangle of fine wire and a single earphone. Meisner, following the instructions remembered from Huntsville, tuned at the same hour on Sunday and found the same voice from London reading out the progress of the campaign. In a camp in Wisconsin, near fields of sugar beets, another former Huntsville man did the same with a similar device hidden inside a hollowed table leg. None of them transmitted a word. They did not need to. The broadcast itself was the common reference, the proof that their clocks and coils matched. When mail went out weeks later from these different places, some letters to Huntsville mentioned, in between talk of weather and food, that the Sunday song was strong, or that the announcer from the island spoke very clearly last week. To American censors, such lines were meaningless or sentimental. To Karl, reading them slowly at a barracks table months after he had first lifted the earpiece to his ear, they confirmed that his impossible radio had escaped its hiding place and become something that no search for tunnels or maps would easily uncover, a pattern of synchronized listening that linked German prisoners across a continent, allowing them to confront the reality of a vast industrial war not as isolated men behind separate fences, but as participants in a quiet, factual conversation carried by the air itself. By late summer 1944, the evenings in Camp Huntsville carried a different weight than the year before. The same guard towers stood at the corners, the same double fences, the same pine trees outside the wire. The routines continued with mechanical precision, but the talk in the barracks had changed. Karl Weber lay again on his lower bunk, the wood now familiar against his shoulder, the hidden compartment under the slat worn smooth by careful hands. The radio inside had been rebuilt twice with better parts scavenged from discarded American field telephones and a broken civilian set once used in the recreation hall. Its performance was still modest, but its selectivity had improved. He could now find the BBC German service more quickly, could separate it from the stronger American stations that crowded the bands. In August, he had listened as calm voices from London announced that Paris had been liberated after 4 years of occupation, that German forces in France were retreating toward the borders, that Allied columns were moving rapidly through Belgium. He remembered marching through French towns in 1940, past silent people and shuttered windows, convinced the Reich was unassailable. Now, hearing of German garrisons surrendering in cities whose names had once meant victory, he felt no surge of anger, only a slow, heavy confirmation of what his numbers had long suggested. When he repeated this news in careful fragments to the small group around him, men no longer shouted him down as a defeatist. Some stared at the table. Others admitted quietly that letters from home spoke of ruins, shortages, and an air war they had never been told to expect. On certain Sundays, when he tuned to the agreed band and found the familiar announcer, he caught himself thinking not only of Huntsville, but of nameless barracks in Oklahoma, Wisconsin, Illinois, where other men might be listening at the same hour, heads bowed over their own hidden sets, hearing the same words. The sense of connection was not romantic. It was precise, technical, and for him, deeply personal. He had been trained to link distant outposts by signal. He was doing so again, in captivity. Beyond the camp, the numerical structure of the American prisoner system reached its peak. By the end of 1944, more than 370,000 German POWs were held in the United States, distributed through over 500 main and branch camps in nearly every state. They cut pulpwood in the South, harvested sugar beets in the Midwest, worked in canneries and lumber mills, and maintained army depots under guard, their labor valued in official reports at hundreds of millions of wartime dollars. The War Department's Special Projects Division expanded its re-education program in selected camps, screening prisoners to identify anti-Nazi elements and offering them classes on history, economics, and democratic institutions. Camp newspapers multiplied, from Fort Kearny's Der Ruf to local bulletins in Texas and the Midwest, printing essays, poetry, and cautiously framed articles on world events. Simultaneously, American security officers watched for signs of organized Nazi activity among die-hard factions, broke up courts of honor, and transferred suspected leaders to more isolated facilities. When improvised radios were discovered, they were usually primitive crystal sets or modified commercial receivers, found in trunks or behind wallboards during surprise inspections. Reports describe table legs, split open to reveal coils, bedsteads with concealed headphones, and aerials run under eaves. Each incident produced memoranda warning camp commanders to check for illegal listening devices and to prevent prisoners from accessing sensitive information. Yet the pattern of these discoveries also showed their limits. Most sets were local projects, built by small groups for their own curiosity or morale. No file in Washington recorded a coherent, continent-wide network, because none existed on paper. What did exist were repeated hints that accurate, timely knowledge of far-off battles and political changes moved faster between camps than official channels could explain. Men arriving at one camp already knew of events that had occurred days earlier, as if they had listened together. To the American officers summing up columns of figures, this was a minor puzzle in a vast, functioning system. To a man like Karl, it was evidence that the idea he had sent outward had taken root in ways even he could not fully trace. With growth came danger. In October 1944, a routine inspection in one of Huntsville's branch camps uncovered a small wire running from a barracks window frame to a bunk post. An American sergeant, more curious than usual, followed it, pried up a plank, and exposed a crude detector and headphone. The device was not Karl's work, but the reaction reverberated through the entire Huntsville complex. There were sudden searches, bunks dragged away from walls, blankets shaken, personal boxes emptied onto floors. Guards tore down improvised clotheslines and ordered that no wires be strung in attics. A rumor spread that secret radios were being used to coordinate escapes, though no evidence supported it. For 3 nights, Karl did not touch his own set. He lay stiff on his bunk while boots thudded past outside and torches played across window glass. The hiding place under his slat, disguised as a structural brace, held. When the searches eased, he dismantled half the circuit anyway, scattering components to be reclaimed later, a precaution learned from years in the field. One evening, a young prisoner from another barracks approached him in the yard, eyes narrowed, and asked outright whether he was the one with London in his ear. Karl looked at him for a long moment, before answering in a flat voice that such talk was foolish and dangerous. The young man shrugged and walked away. It was then that Karl understood what he had created. The original impossible radio was no longer just a single object under a bunk. It had become a story moving through the camp system, sometimes exaggerated, sometimes distorted, but always hinting that somewhere, someone could hear beyond the official notices. To protect the real network, he tightened his rule to the point of severity. Only men he had known as professionals, men who understood both the technical and the security side of signals work, would receive concrete guidance. Others would receive nothing but silence. When letters arrived from transferred comrades, he read their careful phrases about Sunday songs and clear voices before lights out, with a mixture of satisfaction and worry. Discovery in any one camp could, in theory, unravel their method. Yet months passed, and while sets were seized here and there, the pattern of coded references continued. Huntsville's own searches eventually grew less intense as guards saw no direct trouble. The war, for them, was far away again. While Karl's hidden work continued, the war itself moved into a phase that gave those broadcasts an even sharper edge. In September 1944, the failure of Operation Market Garden showed that Allied advances were not effortless, but their progress remained relentless. In November, reports reached the camps of the encirclement of German forces in the Scheldt and the closure of Antwerp. From London and American networks, Karl heard regular tallies of German cities struck, synthetic fuel plants destroyed, and rail lines cut. Letters from home, delayed and censored, spoke more often of bomb shelters and hunger. In December, the surprise German offensive in the Ardennes, the Battle of the Bulge, broke into the news with sudden violence. From his barracks in Texas, Karl listened to the early Allied bulletins that at first treated it as a serious but containable attack, then shifted as the scale became clear. He recognized familiar divisional numbers, remnants of units that had once fought in North Africa and Russia, thrown now into one last gamble. In the barracks, opinion seesawed for a few days as some prisoners clung to hope that this counterstroke would change everything, while others, remembering the production figures and shipping lists they had heard, shook their heads. Within weeks, the broadcasts carried the outcome. The offensive blunted, losses irreplaceable, Allied forces resuming their advance into the Reich. Karl shared the bare facts with his circle and watched as they landed without the wild arguments of earlier months. Many men had already, inwardly, stepped past the point of believing in final victory. For them, the Sunday and evening listening sessions no longer served to measure Germany's strength, but to prepare, in some quiet way, for what would follow defeat. That shift aligned, unintentionally, with the aims of the American re-education officers who wanted prisoners acquainted with democratic ideas before repatriation. Yet, what most affected Karl and the men who listened with him were not lectures or pamphlets, but the steady contrast between how the outside world was described by competing voices and how accurately they, as trained observers, could verify those descriptions over time. In that contrast, trust in Nazi narratives withered. The impossible radio, and the network of listening it encouraged, had become one of many small instruments by which German prisoners in America came to understand the true scale of Allied power and the inevitability of Germany's military collapse. How that understanding would shape their return home was still uncertain as 1945 approached. But Karl, lying on his bunk with the earpiece against his ear and the camp quiet around him, had already begun to think of what a man trained in signals could carry back besides memories of defeat.